Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
Hi. Today I'd like to give a few quick thoughts on Occam's razor. Occam's razor, as I'm sure pretty much everybody knows, is, well, colloquially it's often described as, if you have competing explanations, the simplest one is usually the best. Less colloquially, it's often described as, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. However, the curious thing is none of these formulations, and there are others, are actually really found in Occam's writings. William of Occam was a medieval philosopher he came a little bit after the scholastic period, but he was born something like 40 years after Saint Thomas died, something in that range. Saint Thomas Aquinas, that is. And what's especially interesting, so you can't really find this in, at least according to the sources that I've looked for, just check out the Wikipedia article, and they sort of give you the best you can find, which isn't all that close. He certainly believed things like this. He actually used an argument like this, and what's really interesting and sort of ironic is that what he actually used the argument for was destroying Aristotelian categories, Aristotelian causation, really. But also, what he largely attacked was the idea of nature, that he was what's called a nominalist. That is, a simple definition. Nominalism is a little bit hard to pin down. It's frankly a little bit wishy-washy, intellectually speaking. But nominalism is basically the idea that things that exist don't actually have anything in common. Each thing is entirely unique, and all that we have for the categories that we have are all simply names. That you have two chairs, that they're not the same sort of thing in any sense. They simply are two different things, but we happen to call both chairs. Essentially, that all similarities between things are simply reminiscences in us and not actually properties of the things. Now, that sounds very abstract, but what would this mean in practice? Well, although William of Occam, as I understand it, didn't particularly trouble to deny natural science, it actually would mean the destruction of natural science, because you can't have something like a law of physics, because a law of physics would have to apply to things with a nature, and since things don't have natures, which was a big thing, Aristotelian philosophy is all about that. Since things don't have natures, you can't apply to things that have natures, so they can't all act in the same way for the same reason. And in fact, what that Occam's razor, what that principle really was for, was essentially getting rid of science. In that the basic idea is you have all these things that act. Why do they act this way? Well, there's no reason to posit entities that don't exist, such as a law of physics. Posit entities beyond necessity. We know God exists. We know these things exist. So clearly God just makes them do these things in a direct sort of way. There's no reason to posit an entity beyond necessity, such as, for example, a law of physics. So the funny thing, given how Occam's razor tends to be quoted and who tends to quote Occam's razor these days, is that, in fact, its real purpose was destroying naturalism, rather than promoting it, even though it's promoted. Now, as I mentioned, though, and this is kind of the curious thing, you can't really find Occam having stated it this way. He wasn't particularly concerned about it. It wasn't the sort of thing he was after, and so he never really stated it sort of succinctly that way. You can, however, and I just find this really funny and very ironic, find this principle stated by Saint Thomas, who, as I mentioned, died something like 30 or 40 years before William of Occam was ever born. You can find it in the Summa Theologica, Volume 1, and it's actually way in the beginning, right here in Question 2, Article 2. Question 2, Part 1, Question 2, Article 2, which is, whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. It's actually in the third article. I apologize. I have the bookmark here. Third article, whether God exists. And for those who aren't familiar, Saint Thomas, the Summa Theologica, and actually most of what Saint Thomas wrote, philosophical stuff, his poetry obviously was different, But he wrote in a very interesting style that didn't exist before and mostly doesn't exist afterwards. It's occasionally been aped, imitated, that is, but very rarely even that. So the basic format is he has the question, then he has objections, then he has on the contrary, followed by an explanation of the answer, and then followed by answers to the questions. So everything St. Thomas does starts off with a list of counter-arguments to his conclusion, or to his answer to the question. Oh, and it's something, Bishop Barron had pointed this out, but just a very fascinating thing. If you think about it, just something that turns on its head a lot of people's very mistaken notions of the medieval period. Here, St. Thomas lived in the 1100s, in the high medieval period, and here is a friar, a Dominican friar, who is asking the question whether God exists, and gives arguments to show that God does not. He then answers them. But the point is, the idea of that people didn't, the idea of that people didn't really think is just utterly ludicrous and ahistorical. Okay, objection 1. It seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Okay, so that's objection 1, which is that's been talked about as the problem of evil, the problem of pain. I'm going to talk about that separately. The other objection to God existing that St. Thomas has is, further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. Which is basically a succinct statement of Occam's razor, decades before Occam was ever born. But just to finish it off, because I might as well. But it seems that everything we see in this world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. Of course, in modern times, people would just get rid of the existence of will and reduce everything down to the principle of nature. The brain's nothing but the motion of atoms, which are all governed by the laws of physics, and so there is no mind. There's only the illusion of a mind. I've always loved that. I know this is a digression, but I've always loved that idea. I think Daniel Dennett proposed that, something along these lines, though he's by no means unique, that we just have a collection of warring instincts, and that we then rationalize this after the fact as us having free will and having decided upon things. Why? I mean, why is never stated. This idea that we have some need to believe that we are rational and therefore we pretend that we are rational. Well, why? I mean, why do we? It's also false to experience, too. I mean, if you think about it, when you actually have warring instincts, like, do I really want chicken wing pizza or do I really want bacon pizza? And the two don't really go together very well. I know someone will accuse me of heresy that bacon goes with everything, but, let's be realistic. Chicken pizza and bacon pizza are kind of different things. And, for different moods. When we actually have that, like, which do I really want? I kind of want this one. I kind of want that one. I don't want to go for both. What do I do? Well, we have warring instincts. We have, warring impulses. We don't rationalize this as having, I rationally come to a conclusion. We feel the tug of two conflicting impulses. And then at some point we decide between the two of them, quite possibly by taking out a coin and flipping it. That's how we actually experience warring impulses. We don't, post hoc rationalize them. And we don't feel a need to post hoc rationalize them either. When you have these warring impulses, like I really want to hang out with my friends, but I really want to also just go take a nap, we just feel a tug of two different things. We experience it as the tug of two different things. We think of it as the tug of two different things. If we describe it to anybody, we describe it as I'm torn, I'm pulled in two different directions. At some point you make a decision or you flip a coin or the decision gets made for you, whatever the heck happens, we all have this experience, and in no cases do we describe this or have a problem with describing this as, I was torn between two conflicting impulses. I really wanted to do something. I was ambivalent in the classical sense, or the old sense of the word ambivalent, which means you really want to do two different things. How it's always strange when you hear philosophical explanations that you just ask, have you ever lived as a human being? What you're describing is a common experience. You're describing it completely incorrectly. But anyway, pardon me, that was a big digression. So to come back to Occam's razor, which is a very... there's a fun saying about it, and, sort of trying to wrap this up neatly. There's a fun saying, be careful when handling Occam's razor, because it'll cut you if you're not careful. And, so take the phrasing of do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Well, that doesn't mean to have fewer entities than necessity dictates. And so there's another way of saying that same thing. Well, actually two ways that I like. One of them is that for every problem, there's a solution which is simple, elegant, and completely wrong. It's a programming maxim, but it applies to a lot of life as well. That there are just a lot of things where, there's some sort of answer that's really simple and looks great, and it's just utterly wrong. You have to be careful of those, because they exist. The other thing is, I think I've heard it attributed to Einstein, although it's one of those might well be attributed to Einstein because nobody knew where it came from, or, somebody once said this is the sort of thing Einstein might have said, and then people leave out the interim. Who knows how these things transmute? But the saying goes, simplify things as much as possible, but no further. Because a lot of times people will oversimplify. They'll simplify past the point where they're still accurate. And it's very popular these days. We live in very confusing times with a lot of people making very different claims. Worse, because we're in so much communication with so many people. People use words differently. You'll just hear very, very different ideas expressed by the same words. So not only do you have many, many different claims, you have many claims made in very confusingly similar language, which just results in modern life being very difficult, modern intellectual life being very difficult. And well, unfortunately, that's just the position that we're in. And, it's useful to have heuristics to try to, help us to navigate. But you always have to be very careful of heuristics, because heuristics will be wrong sometimes. And they're not things you can live your life by. They're just things to sort of help you until you have time to do a better job. So, yeah, in conclusion, I think I'll end with Occam's razor. It can be a very useful tool, but be careful or you might cut yourself. So, until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.